I never thought I'd see the day my own family would laugh at the woman who raised me. But there she was, Grandma, sitting in her worn-out recliner, her hands trembling like leaves in a storm. I watched as my cousins whispered behind their hands, smirking, pointing, as if her weakness was some kind of circus act. "Grandma, can you even hold the fork?" my cousin sneered. The words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of 1,000 little cuts. I felt my stomach twist, but no one stopped them. My parents, they just sat there, awkward, pretending it was funny. She tried to smile, a soft curve of her lips, but her eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, quivered with hurt. She set her shaky hands on her lap and quietly said, "I've been holding forks a lot longer than you've been alive." The room went silent for a moment. I wanted to cheer, to shout, to defend her, but the words stuck in my throat. I was 12, and I knew the world didn't always side with the old, the weak, the fragile. Dinner continued, laughter bouncing off the walls like cruel echoes. Grandma struggled to lift her glass, her hands shaking so violently that water spilled onto the tablecloth. "Oh my God, look at that," someone snickered. She set the glass down carefully, without a word. That was her power, I realized much later, the patience of a storm, calm at the center while chaos raged around her. After dinner, she retreated to her room. I followed her quietly, not sure what I would say, only knowing I couldn't let the ridicule slide. She sat on the edge of her bed, knitting, her hands still quivering. I swallowed hard. "Grandma, why don't you fight back?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. She looked up, her eyes piercing yet soft. "Sometimes, child," she said, "the world doesn't need my fight. It needs my memory." Her words made no sense to me then, but there was a weight in them, like the calm before a storm. I didn't know it yet, but that night would mark the beginning of something that would change everything. Because later, much later, those trembling hands would hold the key to saving us all. And the laughter that filled the room that day? It would be replaced by a silence far heavier than mockery, a silence of awe, disbelief, and respect. The next morning, the house felt heavier. The echoes of yesterday's laughter still lingered in every corner, like a stain that couldn't be scrubbed away. Grandma moved slowly through the kitchen, her hands trembling as she poured coffee, but there was a determination in her eyes that no one seemed to notice. I followed her quietly, trying not to draw attention. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice small. She paused, looking at me with that same piercing gaze. "I'm fine, child. But sometimes, the past whispers warnings we refuse to hear." I didn't understand what she meant. How could trembling hands and forgetful eyes carry warnings? But there was an edge in her voice, sharp and unyielding. I sensed she knew something I didn't. Later that day, the family gathered in the living room again. Conversations were light, laughter forced. But Grandma remained unusually quiet, sitting on the edge of her chair, her hands resting in her lap. I noticed her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the armrest, her lips moving as if she were whispering secrets to the air. "Grandma, are you listening to us?" my uncle asked, irritation creeping into his voice. She looked up, calm and composed, as though his impatience were a trivial annoyance. "I'm listening, yes," she said. "But sometimes, listening is not enough. One must remember." No one understood, and no one asked her to explain. They just laughed again, this time at the way she rocked slightly in her chair, a trembling motion that seemed so fragile. But that evening, when the storm hit, literally, I began to notice the small things she had been trying to say. The radio had mentioned a severe blackout warning, and yet, while everyone scrambled, Grandma calmly opened a drawer I didn't even know existed. Inside were flashlights, batteries, and an old emergency box. "Grandma, where did you get all this?" I whispered, astonished. She smiled faintly. "I keep these things because memory is my weapon, even when the world mocks weakness." And then it clicked, the warning she had tried to share, the foresight everyone had ignored. It wasn't about the storm outside. It was about the storms we couldn't see coming. And though her hands shook, and her memory faltered in trivial matters, she remembered the things that mattered most. That night, as the wind howled and branches scraped against the windows, I watched her move with purpose, steady despite the tremor in her fingers. I realized, for the first time, that the woman they mocked might be the only one capable of keeping us alive. And in that moment, I understood something chilling: the humiliation of today could become the salvation of tomorrow. It started with a creak, a low, subtle groan from the old floorboards in the hallway. At first, no one paid attention. My cousins were busy with their phones, my parents buried in their conversation, laughing as though the world was nothing more than a pleasant background. But Grandma froze. Her trembling hands gripped the armrest of her chair, and her eyes, those sharp, knowing eyes, darted toward the hallway like a predator sensing prey. "Grandma?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. Instead, she slowly rose, her frail body bending under years of age and labor, yet moving with a quiet authority that made me pause. Her hand shook as she reached for the cane in the corner, but even that weakness didn't slow her. There was a rhythm in her motion, a memory guiding every step. I followed her, heart pounding. Then it hit me, a faint smell, sharp and metallic, curling in the air near the kitchen stove. "Gas," she muttered, almost to herself, her voice low but resolute. I froze. I didn't understand how she knew, but the panic in her tone made me look around frantically. And then it clicked: the stove burner had been left on. I could see it now, the small blue flame dancing dangerously close to the edge of the counter. One spark, and the house could go up in flames. "Everyone, get out!" I yelled, my voice cracking. But no one moved. They were still laughing at some trivial joke from earlier, oblivious. Grandma's hands trembled violently as she reached out, turning off the gas with careful precision. Her fingers shook, yes, but the knowledge embedded in years of living safely, of remembering details no one else thought mattered, overrode the weakness. As the smell dissipated, I watched my family finally notice, their laughter fading into horror and disbelief. My uncle stumbled back, his face pale. How did you?" Grandma didn't answer him. She just turned to me, her eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before, a mix of sadness, quiet vindication, and exhaustion. "This is why memory matters, child," she said softly. "The world will mock weakness, but strength is often hidden where no one dares to look." For the first time, I felt the full weight of their cruelty. Their laughter, their mocking, wasn't just ignorance, it was dangerous. And if Grandma hadn't remembered, if her hands hadn't guided her despite the tremor, none of us would have made it through that night. As I watched her sit back down, exhausted yet calm, I realized something terrifying: the woman they ridiculed was the only reason we were alive. And the real storm hadn't even begun. The storm outside wasn't just in the wind or the rain, it had started inside the house. My family was panicked now, the earlier laughter gone, replaced by confusion and fear. Every shadow seemed taller, every sound sharper. And through it all, Grandma sat in her chair, trembling hands folded, as if waiting for something only she could see. It began when the power went out. Darkness swallowed the house, leaving only the occasional flash of lightning to illuminate our frightened faces. My little cousin Ollie burst into tears, clinging to his mother. My parents scrambled for flashlights, bumping into furniture, their voices rising in panic. And then Grandma spoke. "The cellar," she said quietly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "There's something there we need. Now." We froze. The cellar? None of us had gone down there in years. It was dusty, dark, and, according to my uncle, absolutely unnecessary. "Grandma, what are you talking about?" my mother asked, her voice shaky. Her hands trembled as she pointed toward the basement door. "Trust me. Go. Now." No one moved. No one but me. I had learned by now that her trembling hands and quiet demeanor hid more than frailty, they hid knowledge. And something in the tone of her voice made my skin crawl. I led the way, flashlight in hand, hearts pounding, as we descended the narrow steps. The cellar smelled of damp wood and forgotten years. Old boxes lined the walls, cobwebs stretching across the ceiling. And then Grandma began directing us, her shaky hands pointing, guiding, lifting lids with careful precision. In one corner, hidden under a pile of old blankets, she revealed the emergency generator she had stored years ago. Batteries, candles, and even a first aid kit were stacked neatly beside it. "This," she said, her voice soft but commanding, "will keep us alive until help arrives." I watched her hands tremble as she pulled the generator cords and flipped switches, the flickering light from the device illuminating her lined, proud face. She was the only one calm, the only one who remembered what others had long forgotten. Her weakness had prepared her for this. Her failing memory had saved us all from the chaos of ignorance. My parents finally caught up, and shock replaced their panic. How did you remember all this?" my father stammered. She smiled faintly, eyes glinting with quiet dignity. "Memory isn't always perfect," she said, "but some things refuse to be forgotten. The things that matter cling to us, even when the rest of the world laughs." In that moment, I realized that the laughter, the mocking, the ridicule, they didn't define her. Her hands, her mind, her very being, they defined survival, love, and resilience. And the storm outside was nothing compared to the revelation unfolding inside our hearts. By the time the generator hummed steadily, casting a warm, shaky glow over the cellar, the silence in the house was almost unbearable. My family stood there, frozen, their eyes darting between Grandma and the life-saving setup she had revealed. For the first time, the ridicule from yesterday felt like a lead weight pressing down on all of us. I watched my cousins shuffle uncomfortably, their faces pale and ashamed. The laughter that had filled the room, mocking her hands, her memory, now seemed like a grotesque echo of a world that no longer existed. They had laughed at weakness, not realizing that strength sometimes hides behind the most fragile of exteriors. Grandma, trembling but composed, leaned on her cane. "Sit," she said softly, and we obeyed without question. There was no scolding, no anger in her voice, only the kind of authority that comes from survival, from having lived long enough to know what truly matters. "Do you understand?" she asked quietly, her hands shaking as she lifted a candle. "Do you understand what your laughter could have cost us?" No one answered. My father, who usually tried to control every situation, looked at her with a mix of awe and guilt. My uncle's face was pale, lips pressed tight. Even the youngest children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, clinging to each other like frightened animals. I swallowed hard. I wanted to speak, to tell them how I had felt yesterday, watching them mock her, but the words felt insignificant compared to the reality before us. The trembling hands that had been the punchline of every cruel joke had saved our lives. And for the first time, I saw them for what they truly were, tools of experience, of wisdom, of survival. Grandma's eyes met mine. "Memory is a gift," she said softly, almost to herself. "It can be a burden, yes, but it is also a weapon. Never underestimate it, or the hands that carry it." Her words hit me like a physical blow. The laughter, the mockery, the casual cruelty of yesterday, it all seemed unforgivable now. And yet, she held no grudge. She had acted not out of anger, but out of love, and a quiet, unwavering strength that none of us could claim. I led the way, flashlight in hand, hearts pounding, as we descended the narrow steps. The cellar smelled of damp wood and forgotten years. Old boxes lined the walls, cobwebs stretching across the ceiling. And then Grandma began directing us, her shaky hands pointing, guiding, lifting lids with careful precision. In one corner, hidden under a pile of old blankets, she revealed the emergency generator she had stored years ago. Batteries, candles, and even a first aid kit were stacked neatly beside it. "This," she said, her voice soft but commanding, "will keep us alive until help arrives." I watched her hands tremble as she pulled the generator cords and flipped switches, the flickering light from the device illuminating her lined, proud face. She was the only one calm, the only one who remembered what others had long forgotten. Her weakness had prepared her for this. Her failing memory had saved us all from the chaos of ignorance. My parents finally caught up, and shock replaced their panic. How did you remember all this?" my father stammered. She smiled faintly, eyes glinting with quiet dignity. Memory isn't always perfect, she said, but some things refuse to be forgotten. The things that matter cling to us, even when the rest of the world laughs. In that moment, I realized that the laughter, the mocking, the ridicule, they didn't define her. Her hands, her mind, her very being, they defined survival, love, and resilience. And the storm outside was nothing compared to the revelation unfolding inside our hearts. By the time the generator hummed steadily, casting a warm, shaky glow over the cellar, the silence in the house was almost unbearable. My family stood there, frozen, their eyes darting between Grandma and the life-saving setup she had revealed. For the first time, the ridicule from yesterday felt like a lead weight pressing down on all of us. I watched my cousins shuffle uncomfortably, their faces pale and ashamed. The laughter that had filled the room, mocking her hands, her memory, now seemed like a grotesque echo of a world that no longer existed. They had laughed at weakness, not realizing that strength sometimes hides behind the most fragile of exteriors. Grandma, trembling but composed, leaned on her cane. "Sit," she said softly, and we obeyed without question. There was no scolding, no anger in her voice, only the kind of authority that comes from survival, from having lived long enough to know what truly matters. "Do you understand?" she asked quietly, her hands shaking as she lifted a candle. "Do you understand what your laughter could have cost us?" No one answered. My father, who usually tried to control every situation, looked at her with a mix of awe and guilt. My uncle's face was pale, lips pressed tight. Even the youngest children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, clinging to each other like frightened animals. I swallowed hard. I wanted to speak, to tell them how I had felt yesterday, watching them mock her, but the words felt insignificant compared to the reality before us. The trembling hands that had been the punchline of every cruel joke had saved our lives. And for the first time, I saw them for what they truly were, tools of experience, of wisdom, of survival. Grandma's eyes met mine. "Memory is a gift," she said softly, almost to herself. "It can be a burden, yes, but it is also a weapon. Never underestimate it, or the hands that carry it." Her words hit me like a physical blow. The laughter, the mockery, the casual cruelty of yesterday, it all seemed unforgivable now. And yet, she held no grudge. She had acted not out of anger, but out of love, and a quiet, unwavering strength that none of us could claim. That night, as we huddled together in the glow of the generator, I realized something that would stay with me forever. The world will always find reasons to mock weakness, to sneer at trembling hands, failing memory, and quiet voices. But sometimes, the very thing we ridicule is the thing that keeps us alive. And in that moment, I knew that our lives had changed forever, not just because of the storm outside, but because of the woman we had laughed at, and the power we had failed to see. The storm had passed, but the tension inside our house hadn't. If anything, it had grown heavier, like a shadow that refused to leave. My family moved cautiously, still shaken by how close we'd come to disaster. But Grandma, she moved with a strange calm, her trembling hands guiding her, her eyes scanning the room as if she could see more than we ever could. It started with the phone call. The line crackled, and a stranger's voice spoke in urgent, clipped tones about a broken pipe at the back of the house. Water was flooding the basement, threatening to ruin everything, including the generator Grandma had just set up. Panic rose instantly. My parents shouted, running toward the basement door, while the kids clung to each other, eyes wide with fear. And then I heard it, Grandma's soft, commanding voice cutting through the chaos. "Stop. Listen." Everyone froze. Even the storm outside seemed to hush in deference. Her hands shook, yes, but there was authority in every movement, precision in every gesture. "The valve, the third one from the left," she said quietly, "turn it counterclockwise. Slowly, or it will burst." No one moved. No one knew what she meant. Except me. I remembered seeing her do something similar when I was younger, when a pipe had burst in the old house she grew up in. I grabbed her hand for guidance, and together, trembling but focused, we moved to the valve she had indicated. Water gushed around us as we worked, a chaotic, relentless torrent, but Grandma's hands didn't falter. Each motion, each instruction, was a map etched into memory, a map no one else had bothered to learn. And when the valve finally stopped the flooding, a silence unlike anything I had ever heard settled over the basement. My family gaped. Shock, awe, and a gnawing guilt twisted through the room. The very hands they had mocked, laughed at, and dismissed, the hands they called weak, had prevented another disaster. Grandma, exhausted but resolute, sank into a chair, letting the trembling wash over her as if it were merely a minor inconvenience. "You see," she said softly, eyes locking with mine. "Weakness is often misunderstood. It is not the absence of strength, but a different form of it. One that shows itself when the world refuses to listen." I realized, then, that every snicker, every cruel joke, every mocking glance, they had all underestimated her. And the truth was chilling: if we hadn't learned to trust those trembling hands, we wouldn't have survived another day. The world had laughed at Grandma, but tonight, it was the memory of her hands, and the wisdom hidden within, that held us alive. And I knew deep down that the next test would be even harder. The house felt different the next morning. There was a quiet tension, a fragile respect lingering in the air, but beneath it all, I sensed that the true test hadn't arrived yet. Grandma knew it too. Her hands still trembled, and her memory sometimes faltered with trivial details, but her eyes were sharper than any of ours. They were waiting, calculating, prepared for what none of us could see coming. It started with a phone call from the neighborhood association. "There's a gas leak in the area," the voice said. "Evacuate immediately." Panic erupted. My parents argued about what to take, my cousins panicked over their devices, and the little ones clung to anyone nearby. Chaos swirled like a storm inside our home, mirroring the one that had already tested us. Grandma stood quietly in the middle of the room, her hands trembling so violently that it seemed impossible she could do anything useful. And yet, she moved with certainty, her voice cutting through the panic. "The main shut-off valve is behind the kitchen panel. Turn it before you leave. Remember, the one with the red handle." No one moved. The room was frozen in disbelief, uncertainty, and fear. And then I remembered. Last summer, when I had helped her fix a leaky pipe, she had shown me the valves, explaining their purpose. It had seemed like a boring lesson then, but now every word came back to me. We rushed to the kitchen. I followed her trembling fingers as she guided my hands to the panel. The valve was exactly as she described. I turned it slowly, listening to the hiss of gas fading away. For a moment, the only sound was the thunder outside and the pounding of our hearts. My parents stared, mouths open. My cousins didn't know whether to cry or apologize. And Grandma, she sank into her chair, exhausted, yet calm. "Weakness," she said softly, "is not what you see. It is what you survive with, what you remember, and what you act upon when others cannot." Her trembling hands had done what none of us could. Her failing memory had remembered the detail that could have cost our lives. The irony was bitter: the very things we mocked, laughed at, and ridiculed, her age, her trembling, her supposed forgetfulness, were exactly what saved us again. As I watched her, I realized something terrifying: the world rarely respects the quiet, the fragile, the overlooked. But when the storm comes, the overlooked are often the only ones capable of guiding the rest of us through it. And I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. By the evening, the neighborhood had quieted, but our home felt like a ticking clock, each second heavy with unspoken dread. The gas leak had been a warning, but Grandma's instincts told me the danger wasn't over. I watched her sit quietly in the living room, her hands trembling as she traced the lines of the old carpet. I realized then that her weakness wasn't her failing, it was a camouflage for her vigilance. It came without warning. A loud crash echoed from the attic, followed by a strange, chemical smell. Panic surged through the house like wildfire. My father shouted, "What now?" My cousins screamed. The younger children clung to anything solid, their eyes wide with terror. Grandma's trembling hands gripped her cane, and she rose with unexpected strength. "The attic," she said calmly, almost as if the word itself contained a plan. "It's the old storage. Something is leaking there. We must act quickly. No one moved. Fear had paralyzed them. But I didn't hesitate. I followed her instructions, guided by her trembling hands pointing toward the attic ladder. Every step she took was deliberate, measured, hands shaking, yes, but mind razor-sharp. Upstairs, the smell intensified. Bottles of cleaning chemicals had spilled, forming a dangerous mixture. One spark, one careless step, and the house could go up in flames. Grandma's hands, though trembling, moved steadily. She instructed us to open windows in a precise order, to move the children away from the danger zone, to ventilate the space before any chemical fumes could ignite. Her memory guided every action. Every trembling hand became a lifeline. I followed her every word, doing exactly what she said, heart hammering. And slowly, almost impossibly, we stabilized the situation. When the last window was open and the fumes began to disperse, I looked at her, hands shaking, chest heaving, face pale, and realized the full truth. The woman we had mocked, laughed at, and ignored was the one who had kept us alive not once, but 3 times in as many days. "Do you see?" she asked softly, turning to me. "Weakness is not always visible. Strength is not always loud. Sometimes it hides where no one dares to look." For the first time I understood the weight of our cruelty. The laughter, the whispers, the jokes at her expense, they were not just wrong. They were dangerous. And if we had continued to dismiss her, if we had relied on our pride rather than her knowledge, none of us would have made it through that night. That night, I realized the terrifying truth: the world underestimates those it mocks. And sometimes, the ones it ridicules are the only reason any of us survive. The next morning, the house felt different, quieter, heavier, and somehow smaller, as if it had shrunk under the weight of the past few days. My family moved cautiously, aware of the fragility of the life they had almost lost, aware of the woman who had saved it. Grandma sat in her usual chair, her hands trembling as she sipped her tea, but now the room no longer echoed with laughter. The glances that had once carried mockery were now heavy with guilt and awe. My parents, who had laughed the loudest, avoided her eyes, and my cousins shuffled like children caught in mischief. I could feel it, the slow shift in our family dynamic. It wasn't just respect, it was something heavier, almost reverent. The world had mocked her, but the world's ignorance had no place here anymore. "Grandma," I said quietly, approaching her, we didn't understand before." She looked at me with tired, knowing eyes. "It's not about understanding, child. It's about remembering. Remembering who we are, and what matters." I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. My parents finally spoke, their voices hesitant, trembling. We were wrong," my father said. "We laughed when we shouldn't have. We didn't see how important you were." Grandma's trembling hands folded in her lap. "Love," she said softly, "is not always loud. Sometimes, it is the quiet guidance you only notice when the danger is over, when the storm passes, and you realize someone was holding you steady the entire time." The shame in the room was palpable. My cousins avoided eye contact, and even the little ones seemed to sense the gravity of our failures. But slowly, like sunlight through a storm cloud, gratitude began to creep in. One by one, apologies were muttered, voices small and sincere. For the first time I understood the true measure of strength. It wasn't in loud gestures, flashy displays, or being the center of attention. It was in enduring, in remembering, in acting when others couldn't, or wouldn't. And Grandma, she had done all of that. Weak hands, trembling fingers, a mind that sometimes faltered, none of it diminished her. On the contrary, it was those very imperfections that had shielded us from disaster, that had saved our lives more times than I could count. As I sat beside her, feeling the tremor in her hand as I gently held it, I realized the truth: humiliation is fleeting, but respect earned through quiet strength lasts forever. And finally, for the first time in my life, the woman they mocked had the dignity she deserved. Tomorrow would be different. We would no longer see weakness. We would see the lifeline that had always been there, shaking, trembling, but unwavering. The house felt almost sacred the next morning. Silence lingered in corners that had once echoed with ridicule. My family moved carefully, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Even the air seemed to acknowledge her, Grandma, the woman whose trembling hands had saved us again and again, whose memory had outlasted our ignorance, whose quiet strength had become the backbone of our survival. She sat in her chair, hands folded in her lap, trembling as always, yet there was a light in her eyes I had never seen before. It wasn't just relief, it was quiet triumph. She had weathered not just storms of wind and water, but storms of laughter and cruelty. And she had emerged unbroken. I knelt beside her, letting my fingers brush hers, feeling the tremor that had once been a punchline now feel like the pulse of life itself. "Grandma," I whispered, "we finally see you." Her lips curved into a faint smile, and for the first time, I understood that she never needed us to see her before. She had always known her strength, even when the world didn't. "Yes, child," she said softly. "But now, they must learn as well." My parents approached, hesitant at first, voices trembling. We can't believe we ever laughed," my father said, his eyes downcast. "We didn't understand. We didn't realize." Grandma's gaze swept across the room, calm and unwavering. "You mocked what you did not respect, and you feared what you did not understand," she said quietly. "But now, you know. And knowing is the beginning of wisdom." One by one, the family came forward, each apology heavier than the last. Tears flowed freely, not just for the dangers we had faced, but for the cruelty they had inflicted on her when all she had ever offered was care. Each word of regret was a small step toward reconciliation, but it was her acceptance, quiet and steady, that carried us through the lingering shame. That day, laughter returned to the house, but it was different. It wasn't cruel, nor mocking. It was soft, genuine, and careful, threaded with respect and gratitude. For the first time, I saw my family understand the truth I had known all along: strength does not always roar. Sometimes, it trembles quietly, hiding in hands that shake, in memory that falters, in love that never gives up. Grandma's trembling hands had saved our lives, more than once. They had turned humiliation into dignity, weakness into power, ridicule into reverence. And as I watched her settle back into her chair, exhausted but proud, I realized that the world could mock anyone it chose, but those who survived, those who remembered, those who cared, they were unstoppable. The day they laughed at Grandma had ended. And in its place rose something stronger: respect, love, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that she was, and always had been, the heart that held us all together. If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe to see more tales of courage and unexpected heroes. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs a reminder that true strength often hides in the most unlikely places.